Hi everybody. So the news has come in now that Boris Johnson, Prime Minister's proroguing of Parliament is deemed unlawful. Therefore, he has lied to the Queen. And I think it's Ian Dunn recently, I read on Artist Taxi Driver's Twitter, he'd shared a tweet from Ian Dunn, who has made the very relevant point now that Boris Johnson, on being interviewed about this judgment, although he says he will abide by it, he said he disagrees with it. And he also said, as Ian Dunn pointed out, he commented that this whole thing with the Supreme Court, the whole process, was to frustrate Brexit. And, you know, as Ian Dunn rightly points out, this is absolute doublespeak, isn't it? Because their whole point actually about proroguing Parliament, according to Boris Johnson and his crew, his criminal crew at present, proroguing Parliament had nothing to do with Brexit. It was purely about getting ready for the Queen's speech. It had nothing at all to do with Brexit. And yet now the judgment has come that his proroguing of Parliament for that length of time, and while the country is undergoing in such crisis, now he's saying that this judgment and the legal action brought to the Supreme Court is all about frustrating us leaving the EU. So therefore, all the people that brought this case now and that Boris Johnson appealed against the Scottish ruling in the Supreme Court, they were absolutely correct, spot on, that he did lie to the Queen, to the whole of Britain, to Parliament, because his prorogation obviously was about getting through his no-deal Brexit undemocratically, to literally brush aside Parliament, our democracy, because that's where democracy takes place, in Parliament. So to brush democracy aside and just let this few people who've been elected by a very few people to decide the future of Britain for generations to come, and to wreak such havoc as has recently been exposed, as I've shared in my last couple of videos. I can't tell you, it's been horrendous. To be aware, to know something without a shadow of a doubt, as I know that we are, you know, a hair's breadth away from becoming some kind of a banana republic under this criminal cabal. And they use very dirty, underhand methods. And just to give you an example here, we've got Al Jazeera. Now, I noticed the BBC have been sharing interviews now. I have not seen this interview on the BBC, you know, because they've been sharing snippets of what these people said. But, you know, and so I'm just going to play this little section here from Al Jazeera.
Now to the media. Let's listen in.
We're going to read a short pre-prepared statement and then we'll take questions from you all. The last few weeks have seen an extraordinary series of attacks on our democracy. A parliament elected from 46 million of us was unlawfully suspended by a Prime Minister elected from 160,000. Judges have been threatened by a number 10 source, and those of us who have sought to protect the only institution in our constitution with a UK-wide democratic mandate have been subject to death threats, and some of us have had our home addresses published. I am delighted today that the Supreme Court has protected the foundational principle of any democracy which is the right of members of Parliament to do their jobs for which they were elected. There is...
So, you heard that. The judges have been receiving threats, and even the people representing the case, bringing the case, their addresses have been made public and they've received death threats. When you're hearing things like this, okay, from your top people, your parliamentarians, when you are hearing stuff like this, that is when we know exactly the level of criminality that we are being governed by. Right now, at this minute, Boris Johnson is there at the United Nations representing our country, a man who was being judged by the Supreme Court as a criminal that tried to literally abolish Parliament, that even lied to the Queen, manipulated the Queen. Did they use the same threats, death threats? What kind of threats were used to persuade the Queen, to persuade her ministers, who surely cannot be that stupid? Because surely they need to be sacked on the spot, actually. Because how could they advise the Queen? The Queen relies on her advisors. She can't, she's just an individual human being with all affairs of state, functions and things that she attends to, and receiving various visitors. She relies solely on her advisors. So what pressures were brought to bear then on her advisors, on the Queen's advisors, to persuade her to agree to something that the Supreme Court has judged unlawful? Does the Queen not have access to legal counsel of the standard of the Supreme Court? Now, if you look at my last two videos, I'm sharing some really important stuff, very disturbing stuff about what was planned for this country with this no-deal Brexit. Exactly what was planned. And, it's deeply disturbing. It's been deeply disturbing. And I still don't feel we're out of the water yet, because we're dealing with some very voracious criminals who have a lot to lose if they don't get their no-deal Brexit. Because at the moment, the terms that the EU are putting forward for a deal are unpalatable to this present government. That's why really they want a hard Brexit, because it will involve their businesses being up to EU inspection for purposes of taxes, and also the nature of their investments, holdings in various offshore tax havens. And the fact is that they have been involved in fraudulent business activities, criminal activities, of money laundering, of asset stripping, of fraudulent companies being set up. How is the City of London going to explain to the EU, as Gordon Bowden has exposed, the existence of 250,000 businesses all registered at one address in London? And that's just one out of hundreds of such addresses that apparently are the headquarters for, tens of thousands of companies, registered companies, that often are on the stock exchange, receiving shares, investment funds. Companies that don't actually exist. Or companies that, aren't actually doing anything at all, and yet they're receiving government subsidies. Like, for example, one company that Gordon Bowden exposes, Anglesey Mining. Never mind a thing for years and years, and yet, you know, there's a board of directors going out there selling shares in it. It is receiving subsidies from the government. It does nothing. And it doesn't pay any taxes. So how are they going to account for themselves? You know, people really could end up in jail, and really that's where they belong, considering that these people are the same people that put these Tories into office, who themselves have received huge bailouts despite their criminal activities, and made the very poorest people of Britain suffer, the most vulnerable people, that are responsible for a government policy that imposes austerity on the people to such a degree that nurses are committing suicide, are queuing up outside food banks, NHS doctors are committing suicide, tens of thousands of British people are committing suicide through loss of benefits, loss of their jobs, you know, axing 50% of public services jobs, driving people to destitution. 130,000 dead, according to an official study, economic murder, they have described it as. Now, everybody is saying, well, this is really important, what's happened. You know, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, has been found guilty now of lying to Parliament, to the Queen, and even he's admitted it himself today, as Ian Dunn rightly says, and thank you, Artist Taxi Driver, for retweeting that very important point that he made, that Boris Johnson has turned around and said, well, you know, this whole court case was about stopping Brexit, when actually he stated that his prorogation of Parliament had nothing to do with Brexit. So how can this judgment have any impact on Brexit? Because according to him, proroguing Parliament, you know, the fact that Parliament can now return, it shouldn't have any impact on Brexit. So we have it now from the horse's mouth himself, that yes, prorogation was actually about abolishing Parliament, about scrapping our democracy while they get on with the hard Brexit, while they get on, because Scotland would have left Britain without a doubt. If the Supreme Court had not upheld their ruling, that was it. Scotland would have been gone. And Ireland too. Ireland did not vote for leaving the EU. They voted to stay with the EU. Do you think they were going to tolerate martial law? Corporate troops probably on our streets? You know, this was getting very serious. And in my recent video, I've shared the point about that the government has stated, this criminal cabal presently occupying number 10, has stated that, well, you know, the government has no legal duty or obligation to provide food for the people. So in the event of a no-deal Brexit and extreme shortages, well, you know, they were going to leave it to food banks, charities. Well, where were these charities going to get the food from? You know, in the event of there being no food in the shops. And what, so people are going to give from their own stores of food that they've got for their family? How was that going to work? And now that raises the question then about the legality of the bailouts then that were given to the bankers. Because if a government can turn around and say to its democratic electorate that it is supposedly represents, that actually in times of national emergency crisis or even an event that we, the government, have inflicted upon the nation that means people are left with no food, that we don't need to feed you, we have no legal responsibility to provide you food, you'll have to go and ask charity. Well, why didn't they say that to the bankers when the bankers suddenly had no money? Why didn't the government turn around and explain to them, well, actually, we have no legal obligation to provide you with funds to keep your businesses going, your independent private businesses that have crashed through your own criminal and incompetent activities. We, the people of this country, do you think we're going to starve and kill our people, 130,000 of them, and dump an unrepayable debt on every child, every future generation? Oh, no, they didn't say that to the banks, did they? They didn't say that to the banks. The Icelandic people said it to the banks. The Icelandic people, who fortunately do... media is obviously not as corrupt as ours, because the people were informed about exactly what was happening and exactly what the bailout meant. That's why every single one of them came out and said, oh no. We are living in very, very serious times. And, you know, people need to wake up to it. And it is thanks to our centuries-old institutions in Britain that we've managed by the skin of our teeth. And as I say, we are still not out of the woods yet, because we do not know what kind of government what they will do next. Okay, because what kind of a government abuses their power to such a degree that Parliament itself has to take them to court, that the Supreme Court has to rule against them and judge them a liar and a criminal, actually. A criminal abuse of power. Really, when you look at the information that I've been sharing that has been confirmed as fact, you know, nothing about it is a conspiracy theory. You know, I share facts. And what they've had planned for this country, you know, really it does amount to high treason, because they were planning, and they are still planning, martial law. And at a time that they've invited global corporate militaries like DynCorp, who we know have been directly involved with ISIS, training ISIS. They're in Britain. They're at liberty to bring in troops from abroad, up for hire to the government. This is a very, very, very serious situation. And I don't believe we're out of the woods yet, because as these people have said, they've been threatened. They've been receiving death threats. Even members of the judiciary have been threatened. That is outrageous. The open statement, admitting the open statement now that we know that these people have received death threats. Who published their home addresses? Who can get to the judiciary? Who got to the Queen's advisors? This is a very, very, very serious situation. And as I say, we are not out of the woods yet. Goodness only knows. You know, now they're gearing up for war with Iran. And this, again, Britain is going to be dragged into this. We know that Boris Johnson and President Trump are thick as thieves. Any decent individual really should have resigned immediately on hearing this decision. But obviously he's not. He's just a blatant, barefaced, lying criminal. And he'll sit squatting at number 10 for as long as he possibly can. And if Britain goes into war with Iran, well, what will that be? Will it be a state of emergency? Will it be like, oh no, Britain's at war all of a sudden? You know, look, all I'm saying is we need to be on our guard. I do have faith, and I said that in one of my previous videos, I have faith in the British people, and that includes all of Britain, you know, the privileged classes, the lower classes, as we are called, you know, of which I am one of the lower classes. But I have faith that sense and sanity will shine. And we are at this moment not just, it hasn't just been a crisis for Britain itself as a united kingdom, as a democracy, as a member of the EU to some degree, whether that will be with whatever deal we come up with now, or if we have a second referendum and people change their mind in light of the evidence, and that people understand, well, if we want to leave the EU, then we will have to re-establish ourselves as an independent nation to the extent that we're not going to be facing the kind of horrors that Boris Johnson and crew had planned for us on breaking away fully from the EU, you see. And I think that is why Jeremy Corbyn is the answer. I think his party and his policies will serve to strengthen Britain from within, to strengthen the people, because a strong people make a strong country. And I think to strengthen the people with meaningful employment, building homes, refurbishing schools, refurbishing our hospitals, investing in the NHS, training our youth to be nurses and doctors, so that we don't need to bring in nurses and doctors from the EU, so that we actually raise our own doctors and nurses. Because if the children aren't going to be doctors and nurses and teachers and the professionals that we're bringing in from all over the world, then what are they being raised for then? And as people's incomes get lower and lower, and the very fact that it costs anybody in Britain now wanting to train to be a nurse has to put themselves £50,000 in debt and work for free for up to 3 years. I mean, this situation can't go on. There have been a lot of terrible things happening to the people on the ground that really I just have never received voice in the mainstream media. There's some serious problems, and Jeremy Corbyn, I know, he's visited these people individually. He's talked to people. He understands the problems and what needs doing. Whereas, the Tory party, the very highly privileged classes of Britain are so out of touch with the public, they really have no idea. And that is why they have become so brazen now, And as I say, to even turn around and tell the people at a time when our food supplies were under threat that, and prices expected to rise. So even if what food came into the country would have been unaffordable to the people already struggling to survive on the lowest incomes. We were talking huge price hikes. There was a lot of people ready to make a lot of profit off food, off betting against the pound, of protecting their offshore tax havens. This is a criminal class. This government does represent the actual global banking cabals that have a firm footing in Britain at the moment, and that's why they could go to Parliament and get a huge bailout at the expense of the British people, at the expense of our society, and even if it came right down to it, at the expense of our democracy and our united kingdom, and even the law itself, because there they were threatening the judiciary. So, very sombre times. A big thank you to the people that have been fighting so hard, especially Joanna Cherry QC here, for the British people, and to the Supreme Court for upholding the law, standing by the learned Scottish judges. This is a ruling for democracy, And now we just have to wait and see what's going to be happening next. And I think all start to ponder on the information, the facts now in front of us. Now the cards are on the table, and to start we the people to start to get a grasp of what has really been going on with this Brexit, and also to understand that this attack now, because that's all we can call this, against our own democracy, from agents that want this Brexit, which does include America, you know, Trump fully behind Brexit, Netanyahu, he was there, you know, rushing to number 10 the day after Johnson prorogued Parliament. And there are a lot of foreign interests of foreign governments, including Russia. You know, this collectively, it does really amount to a conspiracy. And as I say, when we look at the evidence, it isn't a theory. We're talking about a conspiracy fact. And, you know, we understand that none of these far-right extremists have a care a jot about the average citizen of any nation, not even their own nations. So, you know, their collective impact on our planet is horrific, actually, you know, what is going on right now. And even this gearing up to war with Iran after America unlawfully tore up a treaty, a peace treaty, an agreement between Iran and America that was officially made, officially accepted by the EU. The whole world recognised this treaty, and for really no reason whatsoever, Trump has torn it up and created this hostility now with Iran, and now gearing up to attack Iran on something that's happening with the Houthis in Yemen. And what looks now like a fabricated story there, that you know, British lives could end up being expended in yet another war created by a pack of liars from a set of liars who ultimately are protecting nothing more than their own financial interests and powers of freedom to commit crime with impunity in this world. And I think that needs to end, and maybe that is exactly what this Supreme Court ruling now is the start of, is the beginning of holding these powers to account. So huge thanks. Thank you for taking time to listen. Please check the information. Check out Artist Taxi Driver's site as well. I think the video that he shared today of his, you know, like literally he was shaking. And I feel exactly the same. I've had a horrendous weekend with this hanging over us because, you know, I was asked to look at the legal argument for Brexit, for an indefinite pause of Article 50 or cancelling it until such a time as we had a government, a trustworthy government, in order to deal with Brexit, till we had a second referendum. And so having gone through that information from May, I mean, I was so alarmed. I was so shocked. I was sick. I was deeply, deeply depressed. It was hard to get up even out of bed in the morning to face, you know, because it's like, oh my gosh. And then when prorogation happened, and suddenly that was the point, people really started to wake up. And to the extent that, you know, Jeremy Corbyn called in Parliament this government a cabal, which is exactly what they are. And it is very scary to have to deal with it. Fortunately, like I say, my faith, I wasn't scared. I was scared for the people. I wasn't scared, but I was deeply depressed at the thought that they might just get away with it, you see. And events since then, this is very heartening news for me. And, you know, Artist Taxi Drivers' reaction to this news, you know, exactly exemplifies my own and a lot of other people in this country. And I think now is the time that we all stand together, that we unite as a people, the British people, and stand by our democracy, and let's see what we can do. So big love and strength to everybody.